Question 1. What factors determine the appropriate course of action for a TOTO employee when a client requests information about an upcoming, unannounced product launch that could significantly impact the company's stock price? Option A. The employee's personal belief about whether the information is truly material enough to warrant strict adherence to disclosure rules. Option B. The perceived likelihood of the information being leaked to the public if not disclosed to the client. Option C. The client's importance to TOTO business and the potential for the deal to be lost if the information is not provided. Option D. Adherence to TOTO internal policies on information disclosure and relevant financial market regulations prohibiting selective disclosure of material non-public information. Correct answer is D. Adherence to TOTO internal policies on information disclosure and relevant financial market regulations prohibiting selective disclosure of material non-public information. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing client interests with regulatory obligations, particularly concerning the disclosure of material non-public information. A TOTO hiring assessment test candidate must demonstrate an understanding of the strict rules governing insider trading and the ethical imperative to maintain market integrity. The pressure to secure a deal or impress a client can create a conflict of interest, necessitating a robust decision-making framework grounded in regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to TOTO internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines, specifically those prohibiting the disclosure of material non-public information to clients before it is publicly disseminated. This aligns with the fundamental principle of fair markets, where all investors should have access to the same information simultaneously. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial markets, strictly prohibit selective disclosure of such information to prevent unfair advantages and maintain investor confidence. Acting in accordance with these regulations is not merely a legal requirement, but an ethical cornerstone of professional conduct in the financial services industry. An incorrect approach that involves disclosing the information to the client to secure the deal fails to recognize the severe regulatory and ethical implications. This action would constitute selective disclosure, potentially leading to insider trading violations and significant penalties for both the individual and TOTO. It undermines the principle of market fairness and erodes trust. Another incorrect approach, which is to delay the disclosure indefinitely without a clear plan, is also problematic. While it avoids immediate regulatory breach, it creates uncertainty for the client and TOTO, potentially damaging the business relationship and failing to uphold professional diligence in managing client expectations and information flow. A third incorrect approach, which is to seek a loophole in the regulations, demonstrates a disregard for the spirit and intent of the law and a willingness to engage in ethically questionable practices. This can lead to severe reputational damage and legal repercussions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue and relevant stakeholders. They must then consult applicable regulations, company policies, and ethical codes. In situations involving potential disclosure of sensitive information, the primary consideration should always be regulatory compliance and market integrity. If there is any doubt, seeking guidance from legal or compliance departments is paramount. This structured approach ensures that decisions are not driven by immediate pressures, but by a commitment to long-term ethical and legal soundness. Question 2. The evaluation methodology shows that TOTO hiring assessment test candidates are expected to strictly adhere to the provided regulatory framework. If a candidate encounters an instruction within the TOTO hiring assessment test that seems ambiguous regarding the handling of personal data during the assessment, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with the TOTO hiring assessment test's specific jurisdiction requirements? Option A. Interpret the instruction based on general data privacy principles commonly understood in the industry. Option B. Consult external regulatory resources to find guidance that best fits the ambiguous instruction. Option C. Proactively seek clarification from the TOTO hiring assessment test administrator regarding the ambiguous instruction. Option D. Proceed with the assessment by making a reasonable assumption about the instruction's intent, assuming it aligns with typical hiring practices. The correct answer is C. Proactively seek clarification from the TOTO hiring assessment test administrator regarding the ambiguous instruction. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because TOTO hiring assessment test candidates are expected to demonstrate a thorough understanding of the regulatory framework governing their conduct, particularly concerning the handling of sensitive information and potential conflicts of interest. The pressure of a hiring assessment can lead to hasty decisions or a superficial understanding of compliance requirements. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all actions align with the TOTO hiring assessment tests specific regulatory guidelines, which are paramount for maintaining the integrity of the hiring process and TOTO reputation. The correct approach involves proactively seeking clarification from the TOTO hiring assessment test administrator regarding any ambiguity in the assessment instructions or the regulatory framework. This demonstrates a commitment to compliance and a professional understanding that adherence to specific rules is non-negotiable. This approach is justified by the absolute priority placed on following only the specified regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines for the TOTO hiring assessment test. By seeking clarification, the candidate ensures they are acting within the defined boundaries, preventing potential breaches of the assessment's strict jurisdiction compliance requirements. An incorrect approach would be to assume the meaning of ambiguous instructions or to rely on general knowledge of hiring assessment best practices. This fails to adhere to the critical requirement of following only the regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines specified for the TOTO hiring assessment test. Such an assumption could lead to a violation of the exam's specific rules, even if the action might be considered acceptable in a different context. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard the strict jurisdiction compliance requirement and incorporate external regulatory knowledge. This directly contravenes the instruction to not mix or reference regulations from other countries or jurisdictions, and to use only the specified TOTO hiring assessment test framework. Professionals should approach such situations by prioritizing explicit instructions and seeking clarification when in doubt. The decision-making process should involve a systematic review of all provided guidelines, identifying any areas of uncertainty, and then taking proactive steps to resolve that uncertainty through authorized channels. This ensures that actions are grounded in the specific requirements of the assessment and the employing organization, rather than assumptions or external information. Question 3. System analysis indicates that a hiring manager at TOTO is requesting that you, as an assessment administrator, slightly modify a standard behavioral interview question to elicit responses that are more favorable to a candidate they are personally advocating for, citing a perceived cultural fit that is not explicitly defined in the TOTO hiring assessment test guidelines. Option A. Inform the manager that you cannot fulfill their request and suggest they speak with a higher authority within TOTO HR department about their concerns. Option B. Suggest to the manager that they provide specific, objective criteria for cultural fit that can be incorporated into a new compliant question, but proceed with the standard question until such criteria are approved. Option C. Agree to the manager's request and subtly rephrase the question to guide the candidate towards a more favorable response, assuming the manager's intent is ultimately to find the best fit. Option D. Politely decline the request, explaining that all assessment questions must adhere strictly to the TOTO hiring assessment test's approved question bank and guidelines to ensure fairness and prevent bias. The correct answer is D. Politely decline the request, explaining that all assessment questions must adhere strictly to the TOTO hiring assessment test's approved question bank and guidelines to ensure fairness and prevent bias. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's direct request and the potential for that request to violate regulatory guidelines. The need for careful judgment arises from the obligation to maintain client relationships while upholding professional integrity and adhering to the TOTO hiring assessment test's stipulated regulatory framework. The correct approach involves politely but firmly declining the client's request, explaining that it cannot be accommodated due to specific regulatory prohibitions outlined within the TOTO hiring assessment test framework. This upholds professional ethics by prioritizing compliance and preventing potential breaches of conduct. The regulatory justification lies in the TOTO hiring assessment test's explicit guidelines concerning fair and unbiased assessment practices, which would be compromised by tailoring questions based on personal characteristics. Ethically, this demonstrates a commitment to integrity and fairness, essential for maintaining trust in the hiring process. An incorrect approach would be to agree to the client's request without question. This would represent a failure to adhere to the TOTO hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, potentially leading to discriminatory hiring practices and undermining the validity of the assessment. Ethically, it signifies a lack of professional integrity and a willingness to compromise standards for client satisfaction, which is unacceptable. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to subtly alter the questions to align with the client's preferences without explicitly stating the regulatory limitations. This is a form of deception and still violates the spirit and letter of the TOTO hiring assessment test regulations. It fails to address the core issue of bias and can lead to unintended discriminatory outcomes, damaging both the company's reputation and the integrity of the hiring process. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to ignore the client's request and proceed with the standard assessment without any communication. While this avoids direct violation, it demonstrates poor client management and a lack of proactive problem solving. It misses an opportunity to educate the client on regulatory requirements and could lead to future misunderstandings or dissatisfaction. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding and adherence to the TOTO hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. When faced with a client request that appears to conflict with these regulations, the first step is to clearly identify the potential conflict. The next step is to consult the specific guidelines of the TOTO hiring assessment test to confirm the nature and severity of the violation. Subsequently, a professional should communicate clearly and respectfully with the client, explaining the regulatory constraints and offering alternative, compliant solutions if possible. This approach balances client service with unwavering commitment to ethical and regulatory standards. Question 4. The performance metrics show a slight dip in the efficiency of the onboarding process for new hires in the last quarter. During a review of recent candidate assessments, you notice that a particular hiring manager has consistently rated candidates from a specific demographic group slightly lower on subjective cultural fit criteria, despite strong objective qualifications. This pattern, while not overtly discriminatory, raises concerns about potential unconscious bias influencing hiring decisions at TOTO hiring assessment test. Option A. Advise the hiring manager to adjust their ratings to align with the team's average, to avoid creating statistical outliers that might draw regulatory attention. Option B. Escalate the issue to senior management with a recommendation to immediately suspend the hiring manager's involvement in subjective assessments pending a full investigation. Option C. Initiate a confidential review of the hiring manager's assessment practices, focusing on the application of cultural fit criteria and providing targeted training on unconscious bias and objective assessment techniques. Option D. Document the observation but take no immediate action, assuming the hiring manager is experienced and likely making sound judgments. Correct answer is C. Initiate a confidential review of the hiring manager's assessment practices, focusing on the application of cultural fit criteria and providing targeted training on unconscious bias and objective assessment techniques. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. Temptation to overlook a minor infraction for short-term gain is a common ethical pitfall. Careful judgment is required to ensure that TOTO hiring assessment test upholds its integrity and adheres to the principles of fair and transparent hiring practices, as mandated by the relevant regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a commitment to thorough investigation and adherence to established procedures, even when faced with pressure or potential inconvenience. This demonstrates integrity and a dedication to fair hiring, which aligns with the core ethical principles expected of any organization. Specifically, it upholds the spirit and letter of regulations designed to prevent bias and ensure a level playing field for all candidates. By prioritizing a fair and objective assessment, TOTO hiring assessment test reinforces its reputation as a responsible employer. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate cost savings over due diligence would be ethically unsound and potentially violate regulatory guidelines. Ignoring potential issues or making assumptions without proper investigation can lead to biased hiring decisions, which is a direct contravention of fair employment principles. Furthermore, failing to follow established procedures for candidate assessment can expose TOTO hiring assessment tests to legal challenges and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, that of dismissing the concerns due to the candidate's perceived potential demonstrates a lack of objectivity and a susceptibility to bias. This undermines the integrity of the hiring process and can lead to the exclusion of more suitable candidates. Professionals should approach such situations by first acknowledging the ethical dilemma. They should then consult the relevant internal policies and external regulatory guidelines. A structured decision-making process would involve gathering all relevant facts, assessing potential risks and consequences of each action, and consulting with appropriate internal stakeholders or compliance officers if uncertainty exists. The ultimate goal is to make a decision that is both ethically sound and compliant with all applicable regulations, thereby protecting the reputation and integrity of TOTO hiring assessment test. Question 5. Benchmark analysis indicates that a long-standing client of TOTO, who has expressed a strong desire for aggressive growth, is requesting a specific high-risk investment strategy. While the client understands the potential for significant losses, they are insistent on this particular approach. As a TOTO representative, how should you proceed to ensure compliance with TOTO hiring assessment tests, regulatory framework, and ethical guidelines? Option A. Conduct a detailed impact assessment of the requested strategy against the client's stated objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation, and if deemed unsuitable, clearly explain the regulatory and ethical reasons for concern while proposing suitable alternatives. Option B. Advise the client that the requested strategy is too risky and unilaterally implement a more conservative investment plan that you believe is in their best interest. Regardless of their stated preference, Option C. Execute the client's requested strategy immediately, as their insistence overrides any potential concerns about risk, given their long-standing relationship with TOTO. Option D. Present the client with a simplified overview of the requested strategy, highlighting only the potential upside and downplaying the associated risks to secure their agreement. The correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed impact assessment of the requested strategy against the client's stated objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation, and if deemed unsuitable, clearly explain the regulatory and ethical reasons for concern while proposing suitable alternatives. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific investment outcome and the regulatory obligation to act in the client's best interest, ensuring suitability and avoiding misrepresentation. The TOTO hiring assessment test, in its regulatory framework, emphasizes a fiduciary duty and the importance of transparent communication. Careful judgment is required to navigate this situation without compromising ethical standards or regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves a thorough impact assessment that prioritizes regulatory compliance and client suitability above all else. This means objectively evaluating the proposed investment strategy against the client's stated objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation, as defined by TOTO internal guidelines and relevant regulatory pronouncements. If the strategy, despite the client's insistence, is deemed unsuitable or carries undisclosed risks, the professional must clearly articulate these concerns, explain the regulatory basis for their assessment, and propose alternative, suitable strategies. This upholds the principle of acting in the client's best interest and ensures that all advice is compliant with TOTO ethical code and the governing regulatory framework. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on fulfilling the client's immediate request without a comprehensive suitability assessment would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the regulatory requirement to ensure that investments are appropriate for the client's circumstances, potentially leading to financial harm and regulatory breaches. Another incorrect approach, which involves downplaying or omitting potential risks to appease the client, constitutes misrepresentation and a breach of the duty of care. This directly violates ethical principles and regulatory mandates for full disclosure. A third incorrect approach, which involves pressuring the client to accept a less risky but less profitable alternative without adequately explaining the rationale or the client's original objectives, also fails to uphold the client's autonomy and may not align with their true financial goals, even if it appears to be a safer option. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the client's objectives and constraints. This is followed by an objective assessment of investment options against these parameters, referencing TOTO internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines. If a conflict arises between client preference and regulatory/ethical requirements, The professional must prioritize compliance and client well-being, communicating their reasoning clearly and transparently, and offering suitable alternatives. Question 6. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a new automated screening tool for initial candidate applications at TOTO hiring assessment test could significantly reduce recruitment processing times and associated administrative costs. However, concerns have been raised about the potential for algorithmic bias and the impact on the candidate experience. Which approach best addresses these competing considerations for TOTO hiring assessment test? Option A. Rely on the vendor's assurances regarding the tool's fairness and bias mitigation features without conducting independent verification, prioritizing the immediate cost reductions. Option B. Proceed with the implementation of the automated screening tool immediately to realize the projected cost savings and address any candidate complaints or bias issues as they arise. Option C. Conduct a thorough impact assessment of the new automated screening tool, evaluating its potential effects on candidate diversity, fairness, and the overall candidate experience, alongside its cost and efficiency benefits, before implementation. Option D. Implement the tool on a limited basis for a specific department and gather feedback only from the hiring managers involved, without broader consultation or impact analysis. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough impact assessment of the new automated screening tool, evaluating its potential effects on candidate diversity, fairness, and the overall candidate experience, alongside its cost and efficiency benefits, before implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because TOTO hiring assessment test, as a regulated entity, must balance operational efficiency with its compliance obligations. The core difficulty lies in interpreting and applying the TOTO hiring assessment test's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidelines to a novel situation, ensuring that any decision made is both commercially sound and ethically defensible, without compromising the integrity of the hiring process or violating any established rules. The correct approach involves a comprehensive impact assessment that meticulously considers all potential consequences of a proposed change, aligning with the TOTO hiring assessment test's commitment to fair and transparent hiring practices. This approach is professionally sound because it proactively identifies risks and benefits, ensuring that decisions are informed and justifiable. It adheres to the spirit of regulatory frameworks that emphasize due diligence and responsible corporate conduct, preventing unintended negative outcomes and maintaining stakeholder trust. By systematically evaluating the impact on candidates, the hiring team, and the overall recruitment process, TOTO hiring assessment test can make a decision that is both effective and compliant. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost savings without considering the broader implications would fail to meet regulatory expectations for a thorough risk assessment. This could lead to unintended consequences such as a decline in candidate quality, reputational damage, or even breaches of data privacy if new systems are implemented without adequate security reviews. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness risks overlooking critical compliance requirements or ethical considerations, potentially exposing TOTO hiring assessment tests to legal challenges or regulatory sanctions. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or personal opinions rather than structured analysis would lack the objectivity and rigor required for sound decision-making within a regulated environment. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the problem or proposed change. This should be followed by identifying all relevant stakeholders and potential impacts, gathering objective data, and evaluating these impacts against established policies and regulatory requirements. The process should include a risk assessment and mitigation plan, and finally, a clear articulation of the rationale behind the chosen course of action, ensuring it is defensible and compliant. Question 7. Strategic planning requires TOTO hiring assessment test candidates to consider the potential impact of proposed new industry regulations on the company's operational framework and future growth strategies. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates a responsible and compliant method for TOTO to address this evolving regulatory landscape? Option A. Focus solely on the immediate financial costs associated with potential noncompliance and adjust the budget accordingly, without a detailed analysis of the legislation's broader implications. Option B. maintain current operational practices, and assume that the proposed regulations will not significantly alter TOTO business model, deferring any review until the legislation is enacted. Option C. Explore legal loopholes and interpretative ambiguities within the proposed legislation to minimize any perceived compliance burden, even if it deviates from the intended spirit of the law. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment to identify all potential effects of the proposed legislation on TOTO business operations, compliance obligations, and strategic objectives, and develop proactive mitigation and adaptation strategies. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment to identify all potential effects of the proposed legislation on TOTO business operations, compliance obligations, and strategic objectives, and develop proactive mitigation and adaptation strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because TOTO hiring assessment test candidates are expected to demonstrate an understanding of how regulatory frameworks influence strategic decision-making, particularly concerning the impact of new legislation on business operations. The core of the challenge lies in accurately assessing the potential ramifications of the proposed legislation on TOTO business model, and then formulating a strategic response that is both compliant and commercially viable. This requires a nuanced understanding of the regulatory landscape and its practical implications, moving beyond a superficial awareness to a deep analytical assessment. The correct approach involves a comprehensive impact assessment that systematically evaluates the proposed legislation's effects across all relevant business functions. This approach is professionally sound because it aligns with the ethical obligation to operate within the bounds of the law and to proactively manage regulatory risks. Specifically, it adheres to the principles of good corporate governance and responsible business conduct, which are implicitly expected of candidates in a hiring assessment. By conducting a thorough impact assessment, TOTO can identify potential compliance challenges, opportunities for innovation, and necessary adjustments to its strategic plans, thereby mitigating risks and ensuring long-term sustainability. This proactive stance is crucial for maintaining TOTO reputation and operational integrity. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the immediate financial implications without considering the broader regulatory context would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for legal compliance, potentially leading to significant fines, reputational damage, and operational disruption if TOTO inadvertently breaches the new legislation. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes maintaining the status quo without any analysis of the legislation's impact would also be a significant ethical and professional failing. This demonstrates a lack of foresight and an unwillingness to adapt to evolving legal requirements, which can expose TOTO to unforeseen risks and competitive disadvantages. A third incorrect approach that involves seeking to circumvent the spirit of the legislation, even if technically compliant, would be ethically dubious and could lead to severe reputational harm and legal scrutiny. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework. This involves identifying all applicable laws and guidelines, such as those governing TOTO industry and operations. Following this, a comprehensive impact assessment should be conducted, considering both direct and indirect consequences. This assessment should involve cross-functional collaboration to gather diverse perspectives. Based on the findings, strategic options should be developed, evaluated for their regulatory compliance, ethical implications, and business impact. And then a reasoned decision should be made, documented, and implemented with appropriate oversight. Question 8. The audit findings indicate a discrepancy in the scoring methodology applied to a specific section of the TOTO hiring assessment test for a group of candidates. The audit report suggests a potential deviation from the approved scoring rubric. However, the hiring manager responsible for overseeing this assessment claims the methodology used was consistent with their understanding of the test's requirements. What is the most appropriate course of action for the individual reviewing these findings? Option A. Accept the hiring manager's explanation and dismiss the audit findings, assuming the manager has a superior understanding of the assessment's nuances. Option B. Proceed with the hiring decisions as planned, noting the audit finding as a minor procedural observation without further investigation or action. Option C. Request a meeting with the audit team and the hiring manager to collaboratively review the scoring rubric, the audit findings, and the hiring manager's methodology to identify the source of the discrepancy and determine the correct application. Option D. Immediately implement a rescoring of the affected candidates based on the audit's interpretation of the rubric and inform the hiring manager of the necessary correction. The correct answer is D. Immediately implement a rescoring of the affected candidates based on the audit's interpretation of the rubric and inform the hiring manager of the necessary correction. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at TOTO to reconcile conflicting information from different sources, one of which is potentially unreliable or incomplete. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that all actions taken are compliant with TOTO internal policies and the relevant regulatory framework for the TOTO hiring assessment test, while also acting ethically and in the best interest of the company. Careful judgment is required to avoid making decisions based on incomplete or misleading data, which could lead to regulatory breaches or reputational damage. The correct approach involves a thorough review of all available information, cross-referencing it with TOTO established hiring policies and the specific guidelines of the TOTO hiring assessment test. This approach is correct because it prioritizes accuracy, due diligence, and adherence to the defined assessment procedures. By seeking clarification and additional evidence, the individual demonstrates a commitment to a fair and compliant hiring process, which is a fundamental ethical and regulatory requirement. This proactive stance ensures that any decision made is well-informed and defensible. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the initial, potentially flawed, audit report without further investigation would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the principle of verifying information before acting upon it. It could lead to incorrect conclusions about candidate suitability or process integrity, potentially violating TOTO internal standards and the spirit of the assessment. Another incorrect approach that involves disregarding the audit findings entirely without understanding their basis or seeking to rectify any inaccuracies would also be professionally unsound. This demonstrates a lack of accountability and a failure to address potential issues within the hiring process. It risks overlooking genuine problems that could impact the fairness and effectiveness of TOTO recruitment. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, understand the nature and source of the information, in this case, the audit findings. Second, identify any discrepancies or ambiguities. Third, consult relevant internal policies and external regulatory guidelines, specifically those pertaining to the TOTO hiring assessment test. Fourth, gather additional information or seek clarification from appropriate sources. Finally, make a decision based on a comprehensive understanding of the facts and a commitment to compliance and ethical conduct. Question 9. Stakeholder feedback indicates that some clients of TOTO are requesting investment strategies that, while potentially aligned with their stated short-term objectives, may not fully consider the long-term implications or the nuances of the current regulatory environment. For instance, a client might express a strong desire for a particular type of investment product that carries higher risk or has specific disclosure requirements that might not be immediately apparent to them. TOTO responsibility is to ensure that all advice provided is suitable, compliant, and in the best interest of the client. Which of the following approaches best reflects TOTO professional and regulatory obligations in this situation? Option A. Advise the client that their requested strategy is not feasible due to regulatory constraints and suggest a completely different, more conservative approach without further discussion. Option B. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and long-term goals, and then present a range of suitable investment options, clearly explaining the regulatory implications and potential outcomes of each, allowing the client to make an informed decision. Option C. Explore ways to structure the client's requested strategy to minimize immediate regulatory visibility, even if it means slightly deviating from the most transparent or straightforward implementation. Option D. Fully implement the client's requested strategy immediately, assuming the client has a complete understanding of all associated risks and regulatory requirements. Correct answer is D. Fully implement the client's requested strategy immediately, assuming the client has a complete understanding of all associated risks and regulatory requirements. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and the potential for those preferences to lead to outcomes that may not be in their best long-term interest, or that could expose TOTO to regulatory scrutiny. Navigating this requires a delicate balance of client service, ethical responsibility, and adherence to regulatory frameworks. Careful judgment is essential to ensure TOTO acts in a manner that is both compliant and client-centric without compromising professional integrity. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective assessment of the client's situation and a clear, transparent explanation of the regulatory landscape and its implications for their stated goals. This demonstrates TOTO commitment to acting in the client's best interest, upholding regulatory compliance, and providing informed advice. It prioritizes a fiduciary duty to the client by ensuring they understand all relevant factors before making decisions. This aligns with the principles of professional conduct expected of TOTO employees, emphasizing integrity, competence, and diligence. An approach that solely prioritizes the client's immediate request without adequate exploration of alternatives or regulatory implications fails to meet the professional standard. It risks misinterpreting the client's true needs and could lead to advice that is not suitable or compliant. Another incorrect approach, which involves imposing TOTO-owned judgment without fully understanding the client's perspective or the regulatory context, can be seen as paternalistic and may alienate the client. Finally, an approach that attempts to find a loophole or circumvent regulations, even if seemingly beneficial to the client in the short term, is unethical and exposes TOTO to significant compliance risks. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with active listening to understand the client's objectives and concerns. This should be followed by a comprehensive analysis of the situation, considering all relevant regulatory requirements and ethical obligations. The next step involves developing and presenting a range of suitable options, clearly outlining the pros, cons, and regulatory implications of each. The client should then be empowered to make an informed decision, with TOTO providing ongoing support and guidance. Question 10. Compliance review shows that TOTO current client onboarding process for new hires may not fully align with the specific regulatory requirements for data verification and background checks as stipulated by the TOTO Hiring Assessment Test Framework. What is the most appropriate next step for TOTO management? Option A. Instruct the compliance team to conduct a more in-depth analysis of the regulatory framework without implementing any immediate changes to the onboarding process. Option B. Acknowledge the findings but defer significant procedural changes until the next scheduled annual review to minimize disruption to hiring timelines. Option C. Implement a temporary, informal checklist for the hiring managers to use during onboarding, pending a full review of the regulatory requirements. Option D. Immediately revise TOTO onboarding procedures to incorporate all identified regulatory gaps, ensuring staff are trained on the updated protocols and that a system for ongoing monitoring is established. The correct answer is D. Immediately revise TOTO onboarding procedures to incorporate all identified regulatory gaps, ensuring staff are trained on the updated protocols and that a system for ongoing monitoring is established. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficient client onboarding with the stringent regulatory requirements of TOTO hiring assessment test. The core difficulty lies in ensuring that all necessary due diligence is performed without creating undue delays that could impact client relationships or business opportunities. The pressure to expedite processes, especially in a competitive hiring environment, can create a temptation to cut corners, which is precisely what regulatory frameworks aim to prevent. Careful judgment is required to identify and mitigate these risks. The correct approach involves a proactive and systematic review of TOTO client onboarding procedures against the specific regulatory framework governing the TOTO hiring assessment test. This means not just identifying potential gaps, but also developing and implementing concrete, documented procedures to address them. This approach is professionally sound because it demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and risk management. It ensures that TOTO operates within the bounds of the law and ethical guidelines, thereby protecting the company from potential penalties, reputational damage, and legal liabilities. Adhering to the spirit and letter of the regulations fosters trust with clients and regulatory bodies. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the compliance review findings as minor or to implement superficial changes that do not fundamentally address the identified risks. For example, simply updating a checklist without retraining staff on its proper use, or without ensuring the checklist covers all required regulatory checks would be a failure. This approach is professionally unacceptable because it creates a false sense of security while leaving TOTO vulnerable to noncompliance. It signals a lack of commitment to regulatory integrity and could lead to significant regulatory breaches, fines, and damage to TOTO reputation. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize speed of onboarding over thoroughness, leading to incomplete or inaccurate client information being recorded, which directly contravenes the principles of due diligence mandated by regulatory bodies. This demonstrates a disregard for the importance of accurate record-keeping and risk assessment. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific regulatory obligations relevant to TOTO hiring assessment test. This involves consulting the official documentation and seeking clarification from compliance officers or legal counsel if necessary. Next, they should conduct a thorough risk assessment of current practices against these obligations. Based on this assessment, a prioritized action plan should be developed, focusing on implementing robust, documented, and trainable procedures. Regular monitoring and auditing of these procedures are crucial to ensure ongoing compliance and to adapt to any changes in regulations or business practices. Question 11. Compliance review shows that a key client for TOTO hiring assessment test has requested that the upcoming assessment for a senior management position be modified to include specific scenario-based questions that are known to highlight the strengths of their preferred candidate, while downplaying areas where another strong candidate might excel. The client explicitly stated, "We need to ensure our chosen candidate shines through." Option A. Inform the client that the assessment can be customized to their specific needs, and propose a collaborative session to develop new questions that directly address the client's concerns about the preferred candidate. Option B. Conduct the assessment as planned, but instruct the scoring panel to place a higher subjective weighting on responses that align with the client's preferred candidate's background, even if not explicitly outlined in the scoring rubric. Option C. Modify the assessment questions to incorporate the client's suggested scenarios, ensuring they are framed in a way that subtly favors the preferred candidate's known experience. Option D. Proceed with the assessment as designed, adhering strictly to the established TOTO hiring assessment test protocols and question bank, and inform the client that the assessment is designed for objective evaluation of all candidates against predefined competencies. Correct answer is D. Proceed with the assessment as designed, adhering strictly to the established TOTO hiring assessment test protocols and question bank, and inform the client that the assessment is designed for objective evaluation of all candidates against predefined competencies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and the regulatory obligations of TOTO hiring assessment test. The challenge lies in navigating the delicate balance between client satisfaction and adherence to the strict legal and ethical framework governing hiring assessments. A professional must exercise sound judgment to ensure that the assessment process remains fair, objective, and compliant, even when faced with pressure to deviate. The correct approach involves prioritizing the integrity and fairness of the assessment process above all else, even if it means disappointing the client's immediate request. This is because TOTO hiring assessment test is bound by specific regulatory frameworks and ethical guidelines that mandate impartiality and prevent the tailoring of assessments in a way that could introduce bias or compromise validity. Upholding these standards ensures that all candidates are evaluated on a level playing field, preventing discrimination and maintaining the credibility of TOTO hiring assessment test. An incorrect approach that involves accommodating the client's request to tailor the assessment questions to favor a specific candidate would be a direct violation of regulatory requirements. Such an action would introduce bias, undermine the validity of the assessment, and potentially lead to discriminatory hiring practices. This would expose TOTO hiring assessment test to significant legal repercussions, reputational damage, and ethical censure. Another incorrect approach, such as attempting to subtly alter the scoring criteria after the assessment to align with the client's preference, also represents a serious ethical and regulatory breach. This constitutes data manipulation and a lack of transparency, which are strictly prohibited. It erodes trust in the assessment process and can lead to unfair outcomes for other candidates. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the applicable regulatory framework and ethical codes. When faced with a conflict, the professional should first identify the core principles at stake. They should then communicate clearly and professionally with the client, explaining the regulatory and ethical constraints that prevent the requested action. If necessary, they should seek guidance from their compliance department or legal counsel. The ultimate decision must always prioritize compliance and ethical conduct, even if it means losing a client or facing initial dissatisfaction. Question 12. Cost-benefit analysis shows that a particular investment product offers TOTO a significantly higher commission than other suitable alternatives. However, this product carries a slightly higher risk profile and a less transparent fee structure, which may not be ideal for the client's stated conservative investment goals. What is the most appropriate course of action for a TOTO hiring assessment test candidate to take in this situation? Option A. Recommend the most suitable product for the client's stated goals and risk tolerance, regardless of the commission structure, and fully disclose all associated fees and risks. Option B. Recommend the product with the higher commission, emphasizing its potential for growth while downplaying the increased risk and fee complexity. Option C. Recommend the product with the higher commission, but only after obtaining a written waiver from the client acknowledging the increased risk and fee complexity. Option D. Decline to recommend any product and inform the client that no suitable options are available, even if other less profitable but suitable products exist. The correct answer is B. Recommend the product with the higher commission, emphasizing its potential for growth while downplaying the increased risk and fee complexity. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because TOTO hiring assessment test candidates are expected to demonstrate an understanding of ethical conduct and regulatory compliance within the financial services industry, specifically as it pertains to client interests. The core of the challenge lies in balancing potential business gains with the paramount duty to act in the client's best interest, a fundamental principle in financial advisory. Candidates must navigate situations where personal or firm incentives might conflict with client needs, requiring a robust ethical compass and knowledge of relevant regulations. The correct approach involves prioritizing the client's financial well-being and objectives above all else. This means that any recommendation or action taken by a TOTO hiring assessment test candidate, acting as a representative of TOTO, must demonstrably serve the client's best interests. This aligns with the core ethical principles of fiduciary duty and suitability, which are embedded in regulatory frameworks designed to protect consumers. Specifically, regulations often mandate that financial professionals must understand their clients' financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives before recommending any product or service. The recommendation must be suitable for the client, and any associated costs must be justifiable in relation to the benefits provided. This approach ensures that TOTO upholds its reputation and complies with its legal and ethical obligations. An incorrect approach would be to recommend a product or service primarily because it generates higher commissions or fees for TOTO, even if a less profitable but more suitable alternative exists for the client. This prioritizes firm profit over client welfare, violating the principle of acting in the client's best interest and potentially breaching regulatory requirements related to suitability and fair dealing. Another incorrect approach would be to overlook or downplay the risks associated with a particular investment simply to secure a sale. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adequately inform the client, which can lead to significant client harm and regulatory sanctions. Furthermore, failing to disclose all relevant fees, charges, and potential conflicts of interest associated with a recommendation is a serious ethical and regulatory breach. Transparency is crucial, and withholding such information erodes trust and violates disclosure obligations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's needs and circumstances. This should be followed by an objective assessment of available products and services, evaluating them against the client's profile and objectives. Any potential conflicts of interest must be identified and disclosed. The ultimate decision should be based on what is demonstrably best for the client, supported by clear reasoning and documentation. This process ensures that recommendations are not only compliant, but also ethically sound and aligned with the long-term interests of both the client and the firm. Question 13. Stakeholder feedback indicates that some candidates perceive the TOTO hiring assessment test as not accurately reflecting the skills required for certain roles, leading to concerns about fairness. As a TOTO hiring manager, which of the following actions best aligns with the regulatory framework governing the TOTO hiring assessment test? Option A. Introduce a new, supplementary assessment designed to capture the skills stakeholders believe are missing, without formally validating it against the TOTO hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. Option B. Immediately revise the scoring rubric for the assessment to address the perceived fairness issues raised by stakeholders, without further investigation into the assessment's underlying structure. Option C. Inform stakeholders that the TOTO hiring assessment test is designed to be objective and that individual perceptions do not necessitate changes to the established assessment process. Option D. Initiate a comprehensive review of the TOTO hiring assessment test's validity and reliability against the job requirements, referencing the TOTO hiring assessment test's specific regulatory guidelines to determine if any adjustments are necessary to ensure fairness and accuracy. The correct answer is D. Initiate a comprehensive review of the TOTO hiring assessment test's validity and reliability against the job requirements, referencing the TOTO hiring assessment test's specific regulatory guidelines to determine if any adjustments are necessary to ensure fairness and accuracy. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing competing stakeholder interests with the regulatory obligations of TOTO. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting and applying the TOTO hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework to a situation where feedback suggests a potential disconnect between assessment outcomes and perceived fairness. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of the assessment's purpose, the relevant regulatory guidelines, and the ethical imperative to ensure a fair and transparent hiring process. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the TOTO hiring assessment test's established regulatory framework, focusing on the principles of validity, reliability, and fairness as defined within that framework. This approach is professionally sound because it directly addresses the stakeholder feedback by seeking to understand if the assessment, as regulated, is functioning as intended and meeting its objectives. Specifically, it aligns with the regulatory requirement to ensure that hiring processes are based on objective criteria and are free from bias, as stipulated by the TOTO hiring assessment test's governing guidelines. This systematic review allows for an evidence-based determination of whether any adjustments are needed to maintain compliance and uphold the integrity of the hiring process. An incorrect approach would be to immediately alter the assessment criteria based solely on anecdotal stakeholder feedback, without first consulting the TOTO hiring assessment test's regulatory framework. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses the established procedures for assessment validation and modification, potentially leading to a less objective or even discriminatory hiring process. It fails to adhere to the principle of evidence-based decision-making mandated by regulatory compliance. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the stakeholder feedback entirely, assuming the assessment is inherently correct. This is professionally unsound as it ignores potential issues that could impact the fairness and effectiveness of the hiring process, and it fails to engage with feedback that might highlight areas where the assessment, while compliant, could be improved in practice. It also risks alienating stakeholders and undermining trust in TOTO hiring practices. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, acknowledge and document all stakeholder feedback. Second, consult the relevant regulatory framework. In this case, the TOTO hiring assessment test specific guidelines to understand the established principles and procedures. Third, conduct an objective analysis of the feedback in light of these regulations, seeking evidence to support or refute the concerns. Fourth, if issues are identified, develop a plan for addressing them that is consistent with the regulatory framework, which may involve further validation, calibration, or minor adjustments rather than wholesale changes. Finally, communicate the findings and any actions taken to relevant stakeholders. Question 14. The control framework reveals that TOTO hiring assessment test has implemented a series of internal policies and procedures designed to ensure adherence to its regulatory obligations. However, a recent internal audit highlighted potential gaps in the consistent application of these controls across different departments. Considering the TOTO hiring assessment test's commitment to regulatory compliance, which of the following approaches to addressing these identified gaps is most professionally sound and aligned with best practices in risk management for a financial services firm? Option A. Assume that the existing operational procedures, if followed diligently, will inherently address any compliance risks and focus on reinforcing the importance of adherence to these procedures. Option B. Perform a quick review of TOTO hiring assessment test's compliance documentation to ensure it is up to date, without undertaking a detailed risk assessment of operational application. Option C. Prioritize the immediate implementation of new business initiatives that are expected to drive revenue growth for TOTO hiring assessment test, deferring a detailed review of control application until after these initiatives are launched. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment specifically focused on identifying potential compliance breaches arising from the inconsistent application of TOTO hiring assessment tests, internal policies, and procedures, and develop targeted mitigation strategies. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive risk assessment specifically focused on identifying potential compliance breaches arising from the inconsistent application of TOTO hiring assessment tests, internal policies, and procedures, and develop targeted mitigation strategies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because TOTO hiring assessment test, as a financial services entity, operates under stringent regulatory oversight. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for robust risk assessment with the imperative to comply with specific, potentially evolving, regulatory requirements. Misinterpreting or inadequately applying these requirements can lead to significant compliance breaches, reputational damage, and financial penalties. The correct approach involves a proactive and documented assessment of potential risks to TOTO hiring assessment tests' compliance with its regulatory obligations, specifically focusing on the TOTO hiring assessment tests' internal policies and procedures. This is professionally sound because it directly addresses the requirement to identify and mitigate risks that could lead to non-compliance. Regulatory bodies, such as those governing financial services in the relevant jurisdiction, assumed to be the UK for this exam context, aligning with SISI guidelines, expect firms to have a systematic process for risk management that is integrated into their operational framework. This approach demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to maintaining regulatory adherence, which is a fundamental ethical and legal obligation. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the TOTO hiring assessment tests' existing operational procedures without a specific risk assessment lens. This is flawed because operational procedures, while important, may not inherently identify or address all potential compliance risks, might be outdated or not designed with the current regulatory landscape in mind. Another incorrect approach would be to conduct a superficial review of TOTO hiring assessment tests' compliance documentation without a structured risk assessment methodology. This fails to provide the necessary depth and systematic analysis required to uncover subtle or emerging risks. Finally, an approach that prioritizes immediate business objectives over a thorough risk assessment would be professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a disregard for regulatory obligations and ethical responsibilities, potentially exposing TOTO hiring assessment tests to significant harm. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific regulatory environment applicable to TOTO hiring assessment tests. This involves identifying all relevant laws, regulations, and industry guidelines. Subsequently, a systematic risk assessment process should be implemented, focusing on how TOTO hiring assessment tests' operations, policies, and procedures might deviate from or fail to meet these regulatory standards. This assessment should be documented, and any identified risks should be prioritized based on their potential impact and likelihood. Mitigation strategies should then be developed and implemented, with ongoing monitoring and review to ensure their effectiveness. This structured and proactive approach ensures that TOTO hiring assessment test remains compliant and ethically sound. Question 15. Stakeholder feedback indicates that certain sections of the TOTO hiring assessment test may inadvertently disadvantage candidates with non-traditional educational backgrounds. What is the most appropriate approach for TOTO hiring assessment test to address this feedback? Option A. Acknowledge the feedback in internal communications but take no immediate action, waiting for more concrete evidence of bias to emerge. Option B. Immediately revise the assessment to remove any sections that could be perceived as disadvantaging candidates with non-traditional backgrounds, regardless of their actual impact on assessment validity. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the assessment content and scoring methodology, seeking expert input on potential biases and developing targeted adjustments to ensure fairness for all educational backgrounds. Option D. Focus on providing additional training to assessors on how to interpret results from candidates with non-traditional backgrounds, without altering the assessment itself. Correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of the assessment content and scoring methodology, seeking expert input on potential biases and developing targeted adjustments to ensure fairness for all educational backgrounds. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because TOTO hiring assessment test, as an organization, must balance the need to respond to stakeholder concerns with the imperative to conduct a fair and unbiased risk assessment. The challenge lies in interpreting feedback that might be subjective or based on incomplete information, and translating it into actionable risk mitigation strategies without compromising the integrity of the assessment process or creating undue bias. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between genuine areas for improvement and potentially unfounded criticisms. The correct approach involves a systematic and evidence-based review of the assessment's risk factors. This means TOTO hiring assessment tests should first identify the specific concerns raised by stakeholders, then gather data and evidence to validate or refute these concerns. Following this, TOTO hiring assessment test must analyze the potential impact and likelihood of identified risks, and then develop proportionate and targeted mitigation strategies. This approach is professionally sound and ethically justifiable as it adheres to principles of fairness, objectivity, and due diligence. It ensures that any changes made to the assessment process are data-driven and aimed at genuinely enhancing its effectiveness and fairness, rather than reacting impulsively to feedback. This aligns with the implied regulatory expectation for any hiring assessment to be valid, reliable, and free from unfair bias. An incorrect approach would be to immediately implement sweeping changes based solely on the qualitative nature of the stakeholder feedback, without further investigation. This could lead to the introduction of new biases or the removal of effective assessment components, potentially undermining the validity of the TOTO hiring assessment test. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the feedback entirely without any form of review. This demonstrates a lack of responsiveness to stakeholder concerns and a failure to engage in continuous improvement, which could have ethical implications regarding transparency and accountability. A third incorrect approach might be to focus only on the most vocal stakeholders, potentially overlooking broader issues or creating an imbalance in the assessment's design. This would be ethically questionable as it prioritizes a subset of feedback over a comprehensive understanding of potential risks. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process when faced with such feedback. This involves 1. Acknowledging and documenting all feedback received. 2. Categorizing feedback to identify recurring themes and specific concerns. 3. Conducting an objective analysis of each concern, seeking supporting data where possible. 4. Prioritizing risks based on their potential impact and likelihood. 5. Developing and implementing evidence-based mitigation strategies. 6. Communicating the actions taken to stakeholders. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with best practices for assessment design and risk management. Question 16. Upon reviewing an email from a candidate currently undergoing the TOTO hiring assessment test, you notice they are asking for clarification on the specific types of questions they might encounter in the upcoming sections, hinting at a desire for advanced preparation beyond the provided guidelines. How should you respond to this candidate's inquiry? Option A. Provide the candidate with specific examples of questions from the upcoming section to help them better prepare. Option B. Advise the candidate that their inquiry is inappropriate and that they should focus solely on the assessment without seeking external clarification. Option C. Forward the candidate's email to the assessment development team to have them directly address the candidate's concerns about question types. Option D. Politely acknowledge the candidate's inquiry and direct them to the official TOTO assessment guidelines and the designated HR contact for any further questions regarding the assessment process. The correct answer is D. Politely acknowledge the candidate's inquiry and direct them to the official TOTO assessment guidelines and the designated HR contact for any further questions regarding the assessment process. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for information with the regulatory obligations of TOTO hiring assessment test concerning data privacy and the integrity of the assessment process. It is crucial to avoid any actions that could compromise the fairness of the assessment or violate TOTO internal policies and any applicable regulations governing hiring practices and candidate data. The correct approach involves adhering strictly to the established procedures for handling candidate inquiries during the assessment period. This means acknowledging the candidate's request and directing them to the appropriate, authorized channels for information, such as the designated HR contact or the official assessment guidelines. This approach is correct because it upholds the principles of fairness and transparency in the hiring process, ensures that all candidates receive information through official and consistent means, and protects the confidentiality of assessment materials and candidate data, aligning with TOTO commitment to a robust and ethical hiring framework. An incorrect approach would be to provide the candidate with direct answers or insights into the assessment questions. This is a regulatory and ethical failure because it compromises the integrity of the assessment by giving one candidate an unfair advantage over others. It also violates TOTO duty to maintain a confidential and objective evaluation process. Furthermore, sharing assessment content could breach data privacy regulations and TOTO internal policies regarding the security of proprietary assessment materials. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the candidate's request entirely. This is a failure in professional conduct and customer service. While it might seem to avoid compromising the assessment, it demonstrates a lack of responsiveness and can lead to a negative candidate experience, potentially damaging TOTO reputation. It also fails to guide the candidate to the correct channels for information, leaving them uninformed and potentially frustrated. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of TOTO hiring policies, data protection guidelines, and ethical standards. When faced with a candidate inquiry during an assessment, the professional should 1. Recognize the sensitivity of the situation. 2. Consult TOTO internal guidelines on candidate communication during assessments. 3. If unsure, seek guidance from a supervisor or the HR department. 4. Respond professionally and courteously, directing the candidate to the authorized source of information without divulging any assessment-related details. Question 17. Governance review demonstrates that TOTO hiring assessment test has consistently adhered to its internal regulatory framework regarding candidate evaluation, ensuring objectivity and fairness. However, a recent client engagement involved a request to adjust the assessment criteria to favor a specific candidate who was perceived by the client to be a better cultural fit, despite lower scores in other key areas. Which of the following represents the most appropriate professional response for TOTO hiring assessment test in this situation? Option A. Agree to the client's request and modify the assessment criteria to reflect their preference, ensuring the client's satisfaction and maintaining the business relationship. Option B. Politely decline the client's request to adjust assessment criteria, explaining that TOTO hiring assessment test's regulatory framework mandates objective evaluation based on predefined criteria, and that any deviation would compromise the integrity of the assessment. Option C. Provide the client with a revised assessment report that highlights the candidate's strengths in areas aligned with the client's preference, while downplaying scores in other areas, to indirectly influence the client's decision. Option D. Inform the client that the assessment results are final and unchangeable, without further explanation or discussion of the TOTO hiring assessment test's regulatory obligations. The correct answer is B. Politely decline the client's request to adjust assessment criteria, explaining that TOTO hiring assessment test's regulatory framework mandates objective evaluation based on predefined criteria, and that any deviation would compromise the integrity of the assessment. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's perceived needs and the regulatory obligations of TOTO hiring assessment test. The challenge lies in balancing client satisfaction with the paramount duty to uphold the integrity of the hiring process and adhere strictly to the TOTO hiring assessment test's established guidelines. Misinterpreting or circumventing these guidelines, even with good intention, can lead to regulatory breaches, reputational damage, and a compromised assessment outcome. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and strict application of the TOTO hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework. This means recognizing that the assessment criteria are designed to ensure fairness and objectivity, and any deviation, regardless of perceived client benefit, undermines these principles. Adhering to the established assessment protocols, even when a client expresses a desire for a different outcome, is ethically and regulatorily mandated. This ensures that TOTO hiring assessment test maintains its credibility and fulfills its purpose of providing unbiased evaluations. An incorrect approach would be to modify the assessment criteria or scoring based on the client's subjective preferences. This directly violates the TOTO hiring assessment test's commitment to standardized and objective evaluation. Such an action would be a failure to comply with the internal regulatory framework and ethical guidelines that govern the assessment process, potentially leading to accusations of bias and unfairness. Another incorrect approach would be to provide the client with a predetermined outcome or to selectively present results that favor their desired candidate. This constitutes a serious breach of professional integrity and regulatory compliance. It misrepresents the assessment's findings and undermines the entire purpose of an objective evaluation. This action would be a direct contravention of the TOTO hiring assessment test's principles of transparency and accuracy. A third incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's concerns without proper consideration or explanation of the TOTO hiring assessment test's established procedures. While adhering to regulations is crucial, a complete disregard for client feedback can also be professionally detrimental. However, the primary failure here is not in listening, but in allowing that feedback to override the established regulatory framework. The professional decision-making process should involve clearly communicating the TOTO hiring assessment test's regulatory constraints and the rationale behind the assessment methodology, while still acknowledging and addressing the client's underlying concerns within those boundaries. Question 18. The performance metrics show a significant increase in the number of candidates successfully passing the initial screening phase for a critical role at TOTO, correlating with a recent, albeit undocumented, adjustment to the screening criteria. This adjustment was made by a junior hiring manager seeking to expedite the hiring process. What is the most appropriate course of action for the hiring team lead? Option A. Proceed with hiring candidates based on the adjusted criteria, but inform the candidates that the criteria may be subject to change pending a formal review. Option B. Acknowledge the positive performance metric trend and allow the adjusted screening criteria to remain in place, as it appears to be yielding faster results for TOTO. Option C. Immediately revert the screening criteria to the officially documented standards and initiate a review of the junior hiring manager's actions, ensuring all future adjustments follow the established TOTO hiring assessment test protocol. Option D. Conduct a brief informal discussion with the junior hiring manager to understand their reasoning, and then continue with the adjusted criteria as it seems effective for TOTO. Correct answer is C. Immediately revert the screening criteria to the officially documented standards and initiate a review of the junior hiring manager's actions, ensuring all future adjustments follow the established TOTO hiring assessment test protocol. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical and regulatory obligations. The performance metrics, while indicating a potential for increased revenue, also highlight a deviation from established compliance procedures. The core of the challenge lies in making a decision that is not only profitable, but also legally sound and ethically defensible, particularly within the stringent framework of the TOTO hiring assessment test's regulatory environment. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the TOTO hiring assessment test's specific guidelines and regulations concerning performance metric interpretation and the reporting of deviations. This approach prioritizes adherence to established compliance protocols over immediate financial gains. It recognizes that any decision impacting hiring practices must be grounded in the regulatory framework to ensure fairness, transparency, and legal compliance. This aligns with the TOTO hiring assessment test's commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory integrity, preventing potential future penalties or reputational damage. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on maximizing revenue without considering the underlying compliance issues would be professionally unacceptable. This would likely involve overlooking or downplaying the observed deviations, potentially leading to a breach of TOTO hiring assessment test regulations. Such an approach risks creating a precedent for non-compliance, undermining the integrity of the hiring process, and exposing TOTO to legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach might be to implement changes based on the performance metrics without consulting the relevant regulatory documentation or seeking expert advice. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to understand the nuances of the TOTO hiring assessment test's compliance requirements. It prioritizes expediency over accuracy and adherence to established procedures. A further incorrect approach could be to dismiss the performance metrics as irrelevant or misleading without proper investigation. This would be a failure to acknowledge potential issues that could impact the fairness and effectiveness of the hiring process, and it misses an opportunity to identify areas for improvement within the existing regulatory framework. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific regulatory context. This involves identifying all relevant TOTO hiring assessment test guidelines, policies, and legal requirements. Next, they should gather all pertinent data, including the performance metrics and any associated compliance reports. The third step is to analyze this information critically, evaluating potential decisions against the regulatory framework and ethical considerations. Finally, professionals should document their decision-making process and the rationale behind their chosen course of action, ensuring transparency and accountability. Question 19. Examination of the data shows that a long-standing client of TOTO Investments, MS, Alina Vance, has requested a significant shift in her investment portfolio towards a highly speculative, high-risk strategy. This request appears to contradict the risk tolerance and financial objectives she previously outlined during her onboarding and subsequent reviews with her TOTO Investments advisor. The advisor suspects MS. Vance may be influenced by recent market hype or anecdotal advice from friends, rather than a thorough assessment of her personal circumstances. What is the most appropriate course of action for the TOTO Investments advisor in this situation? Option A. Proceed with the requested changes, but include a disclaimer in the documentation acknowledging the client's instruction despite the advisor's reservations about suitability. Option B. Politely explain to MS. Vance that the requested strategy appears inconsistent with her stated risk profile and financial goals, and propose a discussion to explore alternative strategies that better align with her established objectives and regulatory suitability requirements. Option C. Immediately implement the requested portfolio changes to satisfy the client's explicit instruction and maintain a positive client relationship. Option D. Inform MS. Vance that her request cannot be fulfilled due to the apparent mismatch with her risk tolerance, and suggest she seek advice elsewhere if she is determined to pursue this strategy. Correct answer is C. Immediately implement the requested portfolio changes to satisfy the client's explicit instructions and maintain a positive client relationship. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desire for a specific outcome and the advisor's duty to act in the client's best interest, adhering to regulatory requirements. The advisor must navigate the pressure to satisfy the client while upholding ethical standards and legal obligations, ensuring that recommendations are suitable and not driven by undue influence or misrepresentation. Careful judgment is required to balance client satisfaction with regulatory compliance and professional integrity. The correct approach involves clearly and professionally explaining to the client why their requested investment strategy, as currently proposed, may not align with their stated risk tolerance and financial objectives, as assessed during the initial fact-finding. This approach prioritizes the client's best interests by ensuring that any recommended product or strategy is suitable and appropriate, in line with regulatory principles of client protection and suitability. Specifically, it upholds the duty to provide advice that is in the client's best interest, which is a cornerstone of regulatory frameworks governing financial advice. This involves transparent communication about potential risks and the rationale behind alternative, more suitable recommendations. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's requested investment strategy without further due diligence or discussion, even if it appears to contradict the client's previously disclosed risk profile. This failure to act in the client's best interest could lead to unsuitable recommendations, potentially exposing the client to undue risk and violating regulatory obligations. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's concerns outright or to become defensive, which could damage the professional relationship and fail to address the underlying reasons for the client's request. This demonstrates a lack of empathy and a failure to engage in constructive dialogue, which is essential for effective client management and ethical practice. A third incorrect approach would be to agree to the client's request solely to secure a sale or commission, disregarding the suitability of the investment. This constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and regulatory requirements that mandate advice based on the client's circumstances, not the advisor's personal gain. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's stated objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation. When a client's request appears to deviate from this established profile, the professional should engage in open and honest communication. This involves explaining the potential implications of their request, referencing the initial assessment, and proposing alternative solutions that better align with their overall financial well-being and regulatory guidelines. The focus should always be on providing advice that is suitable, transparent, and in the client's best interest, even if it means challenging the client's initial preference. Question 20. Assessment of how a financial advisor at TOTO Financial Services should respond when a long-term client, who has consistently expressed a low-risk tolerance and a preference for capital preservation, insists on investing a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative new venture fund that has not yet demonstrated a track record, despite the advisor's professional assessment that it is unsuitable for the client's stated objectives and risk profile. Option A. Agree to the investment but subtly adjust the client's risk profile documentation to reflect a higher tolerance without explicitly discussing this change with the client. Option B. Politely decline the client's request. Explain that the investment does not align with their established risk tolerance and financial goals, and reiterate the recommendation for investments that are more suitable for their profile. Option C. Postpone a definitive answer to the client, suggesting that further research is needed, while hoping the client will eventually abandon the idea. Option D. Proceed with the client's requested investment, assuring them that the advisor will closely monitor the investment and attempt to mitigate any potential losses. Correct answer is B. Politely decline the client's request, explain that the investment does not align with their established risk tolerance and financial goals, and reiterate the recommendation for investments that are more suitable for their profile. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desire and the firm's ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The TOTO hiring assessment test, in its regulatory framework, emphasizes the paramount importance of client best interests and the avoidance of conflicts of interest. A financial advisor must navigate the pressure from a long-standing client while upholding their fiduciary duty and adhering to the TOTO Code of Conduct. The correct approach involves politely but firmly declining the client's request to invest in a product that does not align with their stated risk profile and financial goals, and instead reiterating the recommendation for a more suitable investment. This upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, as mandated by the TOTO regulatory framework. It demonstrates professional integrity by prioritizing ethical conduct and regulatory compliance over potential short-term client satisfaction or revenue generation. This approach ensures that the client receives advice that is genuinely beneficial and aligned with their long-term financial well-being, thereby maintaining trust and adhering to the principles of responsible financial advice. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request despite the misaligned risk profile. This would constitute a breach of the fiduciary duty, as the advisor would be knowingly recommending an unsuitable investment. This action directly violates the TOTO regulatory guidelines concerning suitability and client best interests, potentially exposing both the advisor and the firm to regulatory sanctions and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to agree to the investment, but attempt to manage the risk without fully disclosing the inherent dangers or the deviation from the client's established profile. This is a form of misrepresentation and a failure to provide full and transparent information, which is a cornerstone of ethical financial advising under the TOTO framework. It undermines the client's ability to make informed decisions and erodes the trust essential to the advisor-client relationship. A further incorrect approach would be to avoid the conversation altogether or to delay a definitive response, hoping the client will forget or change their mind. This passive stance fails to address the ethical and regulatory concerns proactively. It demonstrates a lack of professional responsibility and an unwillingness to engage in difficult but necessary conversations, which is contrary to the proactive and client-centric approach expected by the TOTO regulatory standards. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the core ethical and regulatory principles at play, e.g., client best interest, suitability, conflict of interest. 2. Assessing the potential consequences of each possible action for the client, the firm, and oneself. 3. Communicating clearly and transparently with the client, explaining the rationale behind any recommendations or refusals. 4. Seeking guidance from supervisors or compliance departments when faced with complex or ambiguous situations. 5. Documenting all advice and client interactions thoroughly.